Somewhere in your life, there's already a name that makes your chest tighten a little differently. Not because you're obsessed with her, not because you've built some fantasy in your head, but because every time you hear it, something inside you pauses. And I think you've noticed that. Maybe it happened once in a conversation, maybe online, maybe years ago, maybe recently. But there's a certain name your mind keeps circling back to for reasons you can't logically explain. And no, this isn't about destiny in the childish sense. I'm not talking about soulmates written in the stars or magical thinking. I'm talking about psychology, patterns, timing, the terrifying way human beings recognize emotional familiarity before they consciously understand it. And if you're the kind of man who quietly watches videos like this late at night instead of talking about what's actually happening inside him, then you probably already know exactly what I mean. By the way, if this kind of conversation feels strangely personal to you, subscribe. Not because I need numbers, but because some men spend years feeling emotionally invisible, and sometimes one honest voice can keep you connected to yourself when you're close to shutting down again. Now, there's something men almost never admit out loud. A younger woman can affect you emotionally in a way that completely destabilizes the identity you built around being the mature one. Especially if you've spent years convincing yourself you're logical, controlled, realistic. Because suddenly she appears, maybe not dramatically, maybe quietly, and instead of feeling powerful around her, you feel seen. And that's the part that scares you. Not attraction. Men understand attraction. What unsettles you is recognition. The feeling that someone younger somehow understands parts of you women your age never stop long enough to notice. Your exhaustion, your restraint, your silence. The version of you that became emotionally careful after disappointment after disappointment after disappointment. You tell yourself you're just intrigued, but deep down, you're disturbed by how calm your nervous system feels around her. That's the difference. Lust creates urgency, validation creates ego, but emotional alignment creates stillness, a dangerous stillness. Because now you can't hide behind the old story anymore, the one where you pretend you're better off detached. And I think a lot of men watching this are there right now. You're functioning normally on the outside, going to work, answering messages, laughing when expected. But internally, you've started comparing every interaction to one person, one voice, one energy, one name. And maybe she hasn't even done anything extraordinary. That's what bothers you most. She didn't chase you. She didn't perform for your attention. She didn't try to become unforgettable. Yet somehow, she became unforgettable anyway. Do you know why that happens? Because the human mind becomes attached to emotional interruption. Not beauty alone, not chemistry alone. Interruption. Someone walks into your emotional routine, and suddenly your inner world doesn't behave the same way anymore. You start rereading conversations, not because you're needy, but because you're searching for meaning. You notice the exact moment she laughed sincerely instead of politely. You notice how different your body feels after talking to her. You notice yourself wanting to tell her things you usually keep buried under humor or silence. And that's when the fear starts. Because now this isn't casual anymore. Now the question quietly enters your mind. Why does this feel important? And the truth is, sometimes the people who are meant to change your life do not arrive with certainty. They arrive with emotional confusion, especially when the age difference forces you to confront uncomfortable things about yourself. Things like, how much of my life have I spent emotionally asleep? Or worse, how many relationships did I stay in simply because they made sense on paper? See, men are taught to prioritize stability over emotional truth. So when something emotionally real appears, your first instinct is not surrender, it's resistance. You analyze it, minimize it, rationalize it. You tell yourself she's too young, or the timing is wrong, or you're imagining things. But your nervous system keeps betraying you, because your body always recognizes emotional safety before your mind does. And I think part of you already knows this video isn't random, not because fate brought you here, but because there's already someone on your mind while you're listening to me. You've probably noticed something else too. The connection doesn't feel loud. That's what confuses you. The relationships that damaged you were loud, heavy chemistry, constant uncertainty, emotional highs followed by exhaustion. You mistook intensity for meaning because nobody ever taught you the difference. But this feels quieter. And strangely enough, that quietness almost makes you distrust it more. Because when a man has spent years adapting to emotional inconsistency, peace can feel suspicious. A younger woman who genuinely sees you doesn't always trigger your ego first. Sometimes she triggers your grief. Grief for the years you spent becoming emotionally unavailable just to survive disappointment. I've sat across from men who thought they were emotionally strong, and you know what finally broke them? Not rejection, not divorce, not loneliness. It was being treated gently by someone they didn't expect. That's the thing nobody talks about. A man can survive chaos for years. But genuine emotional safety, that reaches places inside him he stopped visiting a long time ago. And suddenly he notices himself softening in tiny ways. He sleeps differently, speaks differently. Even the anger he carries in his shoulders starts loosening without him realizing it. Then panic arrives, because now he has something to lose emotionally. And men who have experienced emotional loss tend to become very intelligent at one thing: pretending not to care deeply. You know how to delay texts strategically, how to stay cool, how to act detached even while thinking about her constantly. But internally, you're studying every interaction like it contains hidden information, especially late at night, because nighttime removes distractions, and without distractions, truth gets louder. You start wondering why her opinion suddenly matters to you, why one small shift in her tone affects your entire mood more than it should, why hearing her excitement about something meaningless somehow makes your own life feel less emotionally numb. And maybe the strangest part? She probably has no idea how deeply she's affecting you. Men often imagine women are calculating every emotional move, but most meaningful connections happen unconsciously at first. She may simply feel comfortable with you, safe, drawn toward your steadiness. Meanwhile, you're sitting there trying to understand why your chest feels tight every time her name lights up your phone. Because there's another uncomfortable truth here. A younger woman often awakens the version of a man he abandoned while trying to become respectable. Before the disappointments, before the emotional shutdown, before life taught him to hide tenderness behind sarcasm, work, routine, or emotional distance. And when that buried version of you starts resurfacing, it can feel humiliating. Especially if you've spent years identifying as the rational one. You start doing things you haven't done in years, caring about your appearance again, listening more carefully, feeling anticipation instead of emotional flatness. You tell yourself it's temporary, but it keeps growing. Not dramatically, quietly. That's how real attachment forms, not through obsession, through accumulation. Small moments repeated consistently enough that someone slowly becomes emotionally embedded into your nervous system. A glance you remember longer than you should. A sentence she said casually that somehow stayed with you for days. The way she looks at you when you stop pretending to be impressive. That last part matters more than you realize, because many men spend their entire adult lives performing competence, providing, solving, enduring. Very few feel emotionally witnessed. And when a younger woman looks at you without seeing you as what you can provide, but instead as a human being carrying invisible exhaustion, it disarms you. Not sexually, emotionally. That's why this connection keeps following you mentally. Because underneath attraction, there's relief. Relief that maybe, just maybe, someone finally sees the man beneath the armor. But here's where it becomes dangerous. Once a man feels emotionally understood, he starts confronting truths he successfully avoided for years. Truths like, I've been lonely much longer than I admitted to myself. Not alone, lonely. Those are different things. Some men can sit in rooms full of people and still feel emotionally untouched for decades. Then one person arrives and suddenly the emptiness becomes visible. And once you become aware of emotional starvation, it's impossible to unknow it. That's why you keep thinking about her name, not because she completed you, but because she interrupted your emotional numbness long enough for you to feel your own heart again. And this is usually the moment men start sabotaging themselves. Right here. Not when things fall apart, not after betrayal, but precisely when something begins to feel emotionally real. Because now you're caught between two versions of yourself, the man who wants connection and the man who learns survival through emotional distance. Most people don't understand how deeply men adapt after heartbreak. Women are often encouraged to process pain outwardly. Men are taught to metabolize it silently. So instead of saying, "I was hurt," many men become controlled, measured, hard to read. They stop asking for reassurance, stop expressing vulnerability naturally, stop believing emotional honesty is safe. Then one unexpected person slips past all those defenses, and suddenly the system you built to protect yourself starts malfunctioning. You become distracted. Not weak, distracted. Because part of your mind is now constantly occupied by possibility. And possibility is emotionally dangerous for someone who trained himself not to expect too much from life. That's why you keep arguing with yourself internally. One side says, "This could become something meaningful." The other says, "Don't be stupid, protect your peace." But what you call peace is often emotional avoidance with better branding. Real peace doesn't feel numb. Real peace allows emotional movement. And I think some men watching this know exactly what I'm talking about because they've confused emotional deadness for maturity for a very long time. You stopped reacting dramatically, yes, but you also stopped feeling deeply. That's the trade many men unconsciously make after disappointment. They become emotionally efficient. No risks, no vulnerability, no dependence, just routine. Until someone younger enters your life with enough emotional openness to expose how tired you actually are. Not physically, soul tired. The kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly monitoring yourself emotionally. Always staying composed, always filtering what you feel, always pretending things affect you less than they do. And she notices things you didn't expect her to notice. The pause before you answer personal questions, the sadness hidden underneath your humor, the way your voice changes when you talk about your past. A woman doesn't need decades of life experience to recognize emotional weight. Sometimes younger women notice it more clearly because they haven't fully learned to ignore emotional intuition yet. And that unsettles you, because now you feel emotionally visible in a way you can't control. You know what's fascinating psychologically? Men often believe they're afraid of rejection, but many are actually more afraid of being fully known. Because once someone truly sees you, your excuses begin collapsing. You can't keep pretending you don't care about love. You can't keep hiding behind cynicism. You can't keep calling your loneliness independence. That's why this connection feels heavier than it logically should. It's forcing emotional honesty, and emotional honesty changes everything. Suddenly, you're reevaluating your entire life quietly in the background. Your habits, your relationships, even the future you imagined for yourself. You start wondering whether you've been emotionally settling for years, whether comfort became more important than aliveness. And maybe the hardest realization of all? You begin recognizing how much affection you've gone without. Not attention, affection. There's a difference. Attention stimulates the ego. Affection calms the nervous system. One makes you feel admired. The other makes you feel safe enough to stop performing. That's why her presence lingers inside you long after conversations end. Because for a few moments, you don't feel like you have to be invulnerable. And men rarely experience that. Especially men who appear emotionally composed on the outside. People assume calm men are emotionally stable. Sometimes they're just emotionally exhausted. There's a quiet sadness in men who learn too early that expressing need could be used against them. So they become self-contained. But self-contained men still crave intimacy. They just crave it privately, silently. Which is why some of you listening right now are thinking about someone you haven't even confessed your feelings to. You're carrying an entire emotional world internally while acting normal externally. And maybe she senses it already. Women often do. Not through mind reading, through patterns. The extra softness in your tone, the attentiveness, the way your energy shifts around her without you meaning to. And now there's another question haunting you underneath all this. What if this is one of those rare connections I'll regret losing for the rest of my life? That question changes a man. Because regret ages people differently than failure does. Failure hurts your pride. Regret haunts your identity. There's something I need you to understand about regret. It rarely sounds dramatic in real life. It doesn't usually arrive as some cinematic breakdown where a man suddenly realizes he lost the love of his life while rain pours outside the window. No. Real regret is quieter than that. It's hearing a certain song years later and feeling your chest tighten for reasons you can't explain to the person sitting next to you. It's randomly thinking about someone while driving home after an exhausting day and realizing you still wonder what would have happened if you had been emotionally brave instead of emotionally careful. That's the tragedy of many men's lives. Not lack of love, lack of emotional courage. And before you resist that statement internally, listen carefully. Emotional courage is not dramatic confession. It's not obsession. It's not throwing your life away impulsively. It's the willingness to stop hiding behind emotional ambiguity when something real is happening. But many men never learn that, especially men who pride themselves on being rational, because logic can become a beautiful hiding place. You analyze timing, compatibility, social perception, age differences, future risks. And some of those concerns matter, of course they do. But underneath all the analysis is often a simpler truth you're trying not to touch. You're afraid this connection matters more to you than you matter to her. That's the vulnerable center of all this. Not fear of embarrassment, fear of emotional asymmetry. The possibility that she entered your life naturally while you quietly built emotional attachment around her without meaning to. And honestly, that fear makes sense, especially for men who already know what it feels like to invest emotionally and receive uncertainty in return. So now you monitor yourself constantly. You try not to seem too interested, too available, too emotionally affected. Meanwhile, she may simply be responding to you naturally while you're internally fighting a psychological war she cannot even see. That's why men become exhausted in situations like this. Not because love is exhausting, suppression is. Trying to remain emotionally controlled while caring deeply about someone drains enormous psychological energy. And eventually it starts leaking through in strange ways. You think about her during conversations with other people. You replay moments repeatedly trying to decode them. You become unusually sensitive to distance or silence. Not because you're unstable, but because attachment activates emotional memory. And attachment is deeply tied to fear. Not just fear of losing someone, fear of losing what they awaken inside you. That's what men almost never say aloud. Sometimes the terrifying part isn't losing her. It's returning to the emotionally muted version of yourself that existed before her. Because before this connection, you had adapted to emotional survival. You knew how to move through your days without expecting too much emotionally. Then suddenly someone younger walks into your life and reintroduces possibility, warmth, curiosity, desire for the future. And now ordinary life feels different, sharper somehow. Even your loneliness changes shape once someone meaningful enters your emotional world. That's why men become conflicted in these situations. Part of you wants to protect yourself. Another part knows self-protection has already cost you years of emotional aliveness. So you sit there suspended between caution and longing. And longing is a difficult emotion for men because society only really permits male desire when it looks confident. But real longing isn't confident. Real longing is tender, uncertain, human. It's checking your phone more often than usual and pretending you're not. It's hearing her mention another man casually and feeling something heavy move through your stomach before logic catches up. It's trying to act unaffected while privately recognizing she has become emotionally significant to you. And significance changes behavior whether you admit it or not. You know something else I've observed? Men often underestimate how deeply women notice emotional restraint. A younger woman may not interpret your silence as strength forever. Sometimes she experiences it as distance, confusion, disinterest. That's where so many meaningful connections quietly collapse. Not because feelings weren't there, but because both people were trying too hard not to be vulnerable first. And underneath all this is one haunting reality. Time moves whether you act or not. That's the part nobody escapes. Years pass frighteningly fast when you live emotionally half awake. One day becomes another, then another. Then suddenly you realize entire seasons of your life disappeared while you were busy protecting yourself from disappointment. So the real question isn't whether this younger woman is meant for you in some mystical sense. The real question is, why does her presence make you feel more emotionally honest than you've been in years? Let me say something that might sit uncomfortably in your chest for a moment. Not every powerful feeling is asking you to act on it. Sometimes it's asking you to wake up. And I think this is where many men misread themselves. They assume intensity equals direction. If something feels strong, it must be leading somewhere. But psychologically, that's not always true. Sometimes intensity is just a mirror. It reflects back what you've been avoiding in yourself. And this connection you're thinking about, this name that keeps returning to your mind, it may not be a destination. It may be an awakening of emotional capacity you didn't know you still had. Because let's be honest for a second, you didn't stop needing connection. You just got better at functioning without it. There's a difference. One is strength, the other is adaptation. And adaptation can look like strength from the outside while slowly shrinking your emotional world on the inside. So when someone younger enters your life and you feel that strange mix of comfort and confusion, it isn't necessarily about them being the one. It's about what they activate in you. She might not even be doing anything consciously significant, but she's interacting with a version of you that you stopped feeding a long time ago. The version that still gets curious, still feels anticipation, still imagines emotional closeness without immediately calculating risk. And that version of you, it doesn't disappear, it just goes quiet, until something reactivates it. Now here's where things get psychologically delicate. Men often confuse emotional reactivation with romantic destiny. But activation is not conclusion, it's invitation. An invitation to notice how much of your emotional life has been dormant. And I want you to be honest with yourself here, even if only privately. When was the last time you felt emotionally engaged with your own life? Not just distracted, not just busy, but genuinely emotionally present. Not productive, not impressive, present. For many men, that question lands heavier than expected, because presence requires emotional openness, and emotional openness requires risk. Risk of disappointment, risk of rejection, risk of not being in control of the outcome. So instead, many men choose predictability. They build lives that are stable but emotionally thin. Then one unexpected connection enters their world and suddenly they realize how thin things had become. That realization can be intoxicating because it feels like something finally happening. But psychologically, it's often something returning. You're not becoming someone new. You're remembering a part of yourself you stopped using, and she becomes associated with that remembering, which is why your mind keeps attaching meaning to her specifically, not necessarily because she is the source of everything you feel, but because she is present at the moment you start feeling again. That distinction matters more than you think, because it separates emotional clarity from emotional projection, and projection is powerful. Your mind can quietly begin layering meaning onto someone simply because they coincide with an internal shift. That's how attachment forms faster than logic can explain. And it's also why men can feel so emotionally disoriented in these situations. One part of you is grounded in reality. Another part is experiencing emotional reawakening, and they don't always agree. So you start questioning yourself. Why am I thinking about this so much? Why does this feel bigger than it should? Why can't I just be normal about it? But maybe the more honest question is, what part of me is finally being touched again? Because something is happening here beneath the surface. Not necessarily fate, not necessarily romance, but emotional restoration, and that can feel almost identical to falling in love if you haven't felt emotionally alive in a long time. That's where confusion peaks, because now even small interactions feel meaningful. A delayed reply feels heavier than it should. A short message feels colder than intended. A simple compliment from her can change your entire day, not because she controls your emotions, but because your emotional system is reawakening sensitivity. And sensitivity is not something men are often trained to tolerate comfortably. So you start trying to stabilize yourself again. You tell yourself to slow down emotionally, to be realistic, to not overthink. But emotion doesn't respond to commands, it responds to awareness. And awareness, once triggered, doesn't easily disappear. That's why this stays in your mind even when you try to move on with your day. Because something inside you is no longer fully asleep. And once a man becomes emotionally awake again, he usually has to make a choice he didn't expect. Not about her, but about himself. Whether he wants to continue living emotionally guarded or start risking emotional aliveness again, even if it hurts sometimes. And that's where everything quietly shifts. So now we arrive at the part most people never really prepare you for. Not the beginning of a connection, not even the confusion of it, but the moment you realize you've been changed by something that may not fully belong to you in the way you first imagined. And I want you to hear this clearly, without romanticizing it. Sometimes a person doesn't arrive to complete a story, they arrive to interrupt one. To interrupt the emotional patterns you stopped noticing because they became your normal. And I think you already feel that disruption. Not in a dramatic way, in small, quiet ways that accumulate. You think about her name in moments that don't logically require it. You feel a subtle shift in your mood after the smallest interaction. You notice yourself becoming more emotionally aware than you were before. And the mind does something very human here. It tries to turn disruption into destiny, because destiny feels cleaner, easier to hold. But real emotional growth rarely feels clean. It feels like uncertainty mixed with clarity at the same time, and that's uncomfortable. Especially for men who spent years building emotional predictability into their identity. Now listen carefully. This is where I need to bring you back to something grounded. A meaningful emotional connection does not automatically mean meant to be. And a younger person entering your emotional world does not automatically represent a future you should rush toward. What it does often represent is this. You are still capable of deep emotional responsiveness. That part of you did not disappear. It was just waiting. Waiting for something that didn't feel like repetition of the past. And yes, that can feel rare enough to become overwhelming. But here's the quiet truth that protects you from self-deception. Real connection does not require urgency. It does not require mental spiraling. It does not require constant internal debate. It does not require you to lose your emotional center. If something is real in a healthy way, it tends to create clarity over time, not obsession. And if something is awakening anxiety, projection, or emotional instability, that's not a sign to chase harder. It's a sign to slow down enough to understand yourself inside it. Because you are always one half of the equation here, not just observer, participant. So instead of asking, is she meant for me? There's a more honest question that changes everything. What part of me is trying to be healed through this connection? Because sometimes what feels like romantic significance is actually emotional repair happening through proximity. And there's nothing wrong with that realization. In fact, it can be deeply healthy when you see it clearly. Because it brings your attention back where it belongs. Not on prediction, not on fantasy, but on your actual emotional life right now. And maybe this is the real turning point. Not whether you pursue her, not whether she feels the same, but whether you finally start treating your emotional world as something worth understanding instead of suppressing. You don't need to turn this into a story that consumes you. You don't need to rush it into meaning. You don't need to force certainty where there is still ambiguity. Sometimes the most mature thing a man can do is simply stay honest with himself in the presence of something emotionally significant, without collapsing into it or pushing it away, just staying aware, steady, present, and letting time reveal what is actually real, without interference from fear or fantasy. Because what you're really learning here isn't about her. It's about you, your capacity to feel again, your tendency to attach meaning quickly when you've been emotionally deprived, your sensitivity that never disappeared, only went quiet. And if you take anything from this, let it be this. You don't need to chase emotional awakening through one person. You can learn to stay emotionally alive in your own life first. And from there, anything real that enters your world won't confuse you. It will simply meet you where you already are.